The gun was already pressed against the back of Callie Crane's neck when she asked the question that changed everything. She had not meant it as a love confession. She had not meant it as an invitation. She had asked it the way a cornered animal asks for mercy, raw, desperate, furious, because she had been running for 3 years and she was tired. And the man standing between her and the barrel of Warren Doyle's pistol was the same man who had arrested her husband, the same man who had testified against her brother, the same man whose name she had cursed every night in every dirty boarding house from El Paso to Santa Fe. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice cracking at the edges, her dark eyes cutting through the smoke-thickened air of the Last Ember Saloon. She stared at Sheriff Roan Ellery with every ounce of hatred she had cultivated across those 3 long, broken years. And Roan Ellery, 6'2", dust-covered, with a jaw carved from hard choices and eyes the color of weathered copper, looked at the gun pressed to her neck, looked at the fury in her face, looked at the tears she was refusing to shed, and said, quiet as a prayer, "Just breakfast." And 30 more years. Warren Doyle laughed, which was the last mistake he ever made, because the split second his attention shifted from Roan to the woman he was holding, Roan moved. It happened fast. It happened the way violence always happened in towns like Red Hawk, New Mexico, in the summer of 1882. Sudden, loud, and followed by a silence so complete you could hear your own heartbeat hammering accusations against your ribs. When the smoke cleared and Doyle was face down on the saloon floor with Roan's knee in his back and iron cuffs on his wrists, Callie Crane was pressed against the far wall with her hand over her heart, breathing like she had just surfaced from deep water. She was looking at Roan Ellery, and she did not know what to do with what she saw in his face. He was looking back at her the same way. And neither of them spoke again for a long moment, while the piano player in the corner stared, and the bartender slowly lowered the shotgun he had never quite managed to raise, and Warren Doyle groaned into the floorboards and called them both names that were not worth repeating. To understand how they arrived at that moment, at that question and that impossible answer, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the morning Callie Crane rode into Red Hawk with a stolen horse, a forged document, and absolutely no plan. She had been born Callie Crane in 1858 in Abilene, Kansas, the daughter of a cattle broker who taught her to read contracts before she was 10 and to spot a lie before she was 12. Her father had been an honest man in a business that ate honest men, and he had raised her to be sharp because he knew the world would not be gentle with a woman who was not. She had married Thomas Crane at 22, a rancher with good land and warm eyes and a laugh that made you feel like you had just stepped inside out of a cold wind. Thomas Crane was dead by 26, shot during a cattle dispute that was dressed up to look like a land grab and presented to a territorial court as a simple case of theft and trespassing. The charges laid against Thomas himself by a man named Aldous Vick, who owned half the county and the judge who presided over it. Roan Ellery had been the arresting sheriff. He had done his job, which meant that he had arrested the man the complaint named without digging into whether the complaint was honest, and that was the detail Callie had never forgiven. Thomas had died in a holding cell before the trial concluded, of a fever that a man with proper care would have survived. The court had closed the case with a ruling that benefited Vick and left Callie with nothing: no land, no cattle, no husband, and a brother named Paul who had been named as an accomplice and sentenced to 2 years in Yuma. Paul had come out of Yuma different, quieter, harder around the eyes. He had lasted 8 months before Aldous Vick's men found him on the road outside of Tucson, and Paul Crane was buried in a desert grave that Callie only found because a passing freighter remembered seeing it. She had buried her brother on a Tuesday in March of 1881, and by Wednesday she had decided that the only way she was going to survive the rest of her life was to confront the men who had dismantled it. She did not want blood. She wanted truth. She wanted the documents that Aldous Vick had forged to take Thomas's land, and she wanted them in front of a federal court where the local judge could not touch them. 3 years of hunting those documents had brought her to Red Hawk, New Mexico, because Red Hawk was where Aldous Vick had moved his operation, where his new cattle empire was headquartered, and where, according to a land agent in Santa Fe who had spoken to her in whispers over a corner table, the original deed to Thomas's land, the one showing the forgery, was locked in the safe of Vick's business partner, a man named Warren Doyle. What she had not known when she rode into Red Hawk was that Sheriff Roan Ellery had moved there too. She had known his name. She had memorized it the way you memorize the name of a wound, not because you want to, but because it will not let you forget it. But she had not known he was the law in Red Hawk, and when she had walked into the sheriff's office on her first morning in town to file a complaint about a man who had tried to steal her horse at the livery, the most mundane, infuriating reason to walk into a building she had ever had, and she had looked up and seen his face behind the desk, everything inside her had gone cold and then immediately, terrifyingly hot. Roan Ellery had looked up from his paperwork with the mild, unhurried attention of a man who did not yet know he was about to step into the worst complications of the past 2 years of his life. He had a face that had seen a lot of weather. There were lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind, and his hands were large and scarred in the way that spoke of a working life rather than a comfortable one. He wore his badge the way some men wore their faith, not for show, but because he had decided that it meant something and was going to keep believing that even when it was inconvenient. He had recognized her last name before he recognized her face. "Crane," he said, and his voice went careful in a way that told her immediately that his conscience was not clean on the matter. "Ellery," she said back, and the word was not a greeting. They had stared at each other for a long, suspended moment in which the entire history of the past 3 years sat between them like a table covered in broken glass. "I heard about Paul," he said finally. "Did you?" she said. It was not a question. "I'm sorry. Are you?" Also not a question. He had the grace not to say anything else right away, and she had the discipline not to say what she was thinking, which was a long and detailed speech she had rehearsed in her head approximately 400 times, and which would have dissolved the careful structure she needed to maintain if she was going to operate in this town without being removed from it. She told him about the horse. He sent a deputy to deal with the man at the livery. She thanked him in a voice that could have cut glass, and she left. She had not planned to speak to him again. The problem was that Red Hawk was not a big town. It had one main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a land office, a saloon, a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Elspeth Horn, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a sheriff's office that sat directly across from the boarding house where Callie had rented a room. She could not look out her window without seeing the sheriff's office. She could not walk to the general store without passing it, and she could not seem to go more than 48 hours without having a reason, logical or infuriating, to walk through its door. The second time was because of a dispute with a neighboring rancher about the fence line behind the boarding house, which technically Mrs. Horn should have handled herself, but which Mrs. Horn said she was too old and too tired for, and would Callie mind, since Callie seemed like a woman who knew how to handle herself. Roan had listened to the fence dispute with the same careful attention he had given her the first time, asked 2 precise questions, and resolved it in under 20 minutes by pointing to the original survey map on his wall with the end of his pen, and explaining to the neighboring rancher exactly where his property line ended. "You keep survey maps," Callie said when the rancher had left. "Town records," Roan said. "Land records going back to the original grant. Most disputes come down to someone not reading a document carefully." Something in his voice when he said it made her look at him more closely. He was looking at the map and not at her, but his jaw was set in a way that suggested he was thinking about something that had nothing to do with the fence line. "What kind of sheriff arrests a man for trespassing without reading the original deed?" she asked. She had not meant to say it. It came out anyway, because 3 years of restraint has its limits. He turned to look at her then, and the copper in his eyes had gone darker. "The kind who should have read it and didn't," he said, "and who has thought about that every day since." It was not the answer she had expected. It knocked her slightly off the axis of her prepared anger, the way a floor does when it turns out not to be as solid as you assumed. She left without responding. On the third visit, there was no official reason at all. She had been sitting in the window of her room at 9 in the evening, going over the notes she had assembled about Vic's operation and the location of Doyle's safe, and she had seen a light still burning in the sheriff's office across the street. She had watched it for a while, which she told herself was surveilling the enemy's territory and which she suspected, even then, was something else. She had gone over anyway. She could not have explained why, even to herself. She knocked, and he opened the door, and he looked at her like she was a problem he had been expecting but had not quite figured out how to solve. "I want to understand what happened," she said. "Not to fight. I want to understand it." He opened the door wider and stepped back, and she came in. He told her. He laid it out the way a man lays out something he has rehearsed in his own mind until it lost some of its sharpness, not making excuses, but explaining the sequence. Vic had filed the complaint with the county sheriff in Abilene, which was Roan at the time. The complaint named Thomas Crane specifically and cited a specific statute about cattle trespassing on registered land. The documentation had looked legitimate. The land deed Vic presented had looked legitimate. Roan had arrested Thomas on the written complaint and had transferred the case to the county court. "I did not know the deed was forged," Roan said. "I should have investigated more thoroughly before making the arrest. I know that. I have known that since the day I found out Vic had done it." "When did you find out?" Callie asked. He was quiet for a moment. 8 months after Thomas died. A land agent in Abilene showed me a copy of the original survey that didn't match what Vic had filed. I took it to the county judge. "And the judge was in Vic's pocket," Callie said flatly. "Yes," Roan said, "just that. No embellishment. So you quit," she said. She had done her research on him too. She knew that he had resigned from the Abilene sheriff's position in the spring of 1880. She had assumed it was because he had gotten what he wanted from Vic and moved on to some other corrupt arrangement. She was beginning to revise that assumption, and she was not sure how to feel about the revision. "I resigned because I could not be the law in a county where the judge was bought," he said. "I took a position in Santa Fe for a year, and then the position in Red Hawk opened, and Vic just happened to move his operation here. I knew he was here before I took the position," Roan said, and there was something in his voice that made her stop. She looked at him steadily. "You came here because of Vic," he met her eyes. "I came here because Vic is here. And because what happened to Thomas Crane happened because I didn't do my job right, and I intend to do it right this time." The silence in the office was different after that. It was not comfortable exactly. It was more like the silence after a very large stone has been moved and you can see what was underneath it. Surprising, complicated, requiring more examination than you have time for right now. "I need you to know," Callie said carefully, "that I am not here by coincidence." "I know that," Roan said. "I am here for the same reason you are. I know that too." She had not expected to find an ally in him. She had not expected the careful, honest grief in his face when he talked about Thomas. She had not expected any of this, and it was inconvenient in a number of ways she did not want to examine. "Then we may need to talk about this further," she said. "I think we may," he agreed. She went back to the boarding house and sat in her room and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. They began meeting in the evenings. It started as a practical collaboration. She had information about Vic's documents and Doyle's safe that Roan did not have, and Roan had the legal framework and the federal contacts that she lacked. Together, they began building a case that could go to a federal circuit court, bypassing the local judge entirely. She was careful to keep it professional. She was precise and businesslike, and did not allow herself to linger on the way he listened to her. Completely, attentively, as if what she was saying was the most important thing in the room, which she was not accustomed to from men and which she found dangerously pleasant. Roan was careful too, in the way of a man who knows that he is walking on ground that requires care, but has not yet decided whether the destination is worth the risk of the walk. On the 5th evening, he made coffee. On the 6th, she brought 2 pieces of apple cake from Mrs. Horn's kitchen, because the older woman had sent too much to the table and told Callie to take the rest somewhere useful. On the 7th evening, when they had been working for 3 hours, and the lamp was burning low, and she had corrected his spelling of a legal term on the document they were drafting, and he had looked at her with something between exasperation and warmth, she became aware that the professional distance between them had developed significant, unauthorized gaps. She told herself it was the circumstances. She told herself that proximity and shared purpose created a false sense of intimacy that she was too intelligent to take seriously. She told herself these things very firmly for approximately 4 more days. On the 11th day, she was in the general store buying paper and ink and a tin of black tea that was not as good as the tea she had grown up with, but was considerably better than nothing. And she turned around to find Roan Ellery directly behind her, reaching for the same shelf. They were very close. Not improperly close in the physical sense. There was a reasonable amount of air between them, but close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes in the afternoon light, which turned out to be more interesting than she had permitted herself to notice before. There was gold in them and something quieter underneath the gold. "Hello," she said, because it was all she could think of. "Hello," he said. He did not move back. She did not move back either. The store owner was watching them with the slightly fascinated expression of a man who has observed small-town romantic tension evolve for 30 years and can read the signs from considerable distance. Callie broke the moment first because she was the more disciplined of the two and stepped slightly to one side to allow him access to the shelf. He selected a can of coffee with the focused attention of a man who is very deliberately not looking at the woman standing next to him. "Tonight?" he asked, meaning the meeting. "7," she said, meaning yes. He left with his coffee. She stood for a moment, holding her tea, and told herself with diminishing conviction that everything was completely under control. It was not under control. It had not been under control. She admitted to herself that night in her room, possibly since the moment she had walked into his office, and he had said her name, and his voice had gone careful, because careful meant he knew, and knowing meant he had a conscience, and a man with a conscience was the most dangerous thing she could have encountered. She had built her survival on certainty, the certainty of her grief, the certainty of her mission, the certainty of who the enemies were and what needed to be done. Roan Ellery was introducing uncertainty into every corner of that structure, and she did not know what to do with it except to keep working and try not to look at the gold in his eyes. He was having his own complications. She was, in his frank and private assessment, the most formidable woman he had ever encountered, which was not a category of appreciation he took lightly given that his mother had been a formidable woman in her own right, and he had grown up understanding that as a compliment rather than a warning. Callie Crane had arrived in Red Hawk carrying 3 years of catastrophe on her shoulders, and it had not bent her. It had sharpened her. She was precise and fierce and occasionally terrifying in her intelligence, and she had a laugh. She had laughed exactly once, at something he had said on the 9th evening, a dry observation about the territorial court's filing system. And the laugh had done something to the inside of his chest that he was still examining a week later. He had been doing this job for 11 years. He had been doing this specific version of it, the patient, careful, document-by-document dismantling of Aldous Vick, for almost 2 years since he had taken the Red Hawk position. He had not, in any of that time, factored in the possibility of Callie Crane. He thought about Thomas. He thought about it carefully and with the full weight of his conscience, because he believed that grief deserved to be respected, and that a man who had failed a woman's husband owed that woman complete honesty before he allowed himself to feel anything else. He could not undo Thomas's arrest or Thomas's death or the 3 years of loss that had followed. He could only do what he was doing, build the case, expose Vick, and restore what could be restored. And he could be honest with himself about the fact that some part of what was driving him to do it with the relentlessness of the past 3 weeks was that Callie Crane was sitting across from him every evening with her dark eyes and her careful hands and her absolute refusal to be defeated. And every night she walked back across the street, he sat in his office for a while longer and thought about things he had not let himself think about in years. The crisis came, as crises in Red Hawk tended to do, without much warning. On the 14th day, Callie had gone to the land office under the pretense of inquiring about a small property near the edge of town for investment purposes. The land agent, a nervous, thin, mustached man named Garrett who clearly understood more about the territory's real power structure than he wanted to, had been carefully vague about everything she asked, but she had seen, while he was distracted by a question she had arranged to have asked from the other side of his counter by a helpful boy from the boarding house, that the filing cabinet in the back room was unlocked. She had not touched it. She was not going to risk her position in town by doing something that could be used against her. But she had confirmed what she needed to confirm, that the forged deed and the original transfer document were in that cabinet, not in Doyle's safe, which changed the entire plan. She had gone immediately to Roan's office to tell him, and that was when she had found him talking to Warren Doyle, who was leaning against the counter with his expensive hat pushed back on his head, and his cold gray eyes moving between Roan and the doorway where Callie had just appeared. Warren Doyle was not a man you would have picked out of a crowd as dangerous. He was well-dressed and soft-spoken, and had the particular pleasantness of a man who has always had enough money to be pleasant about everything. He smiled at Callie when she came in, and the smile told her instantly that he knew exactly who she was. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "I've heard a great deal about you." "Have you?" she said, and this time she was fully aware that it was not a question. "Vic speaks highly of your persistence," Doyle said. "He finds it admirable. He wanted me to pass along his regards." The room had gone very still. Roan had not moved, but she could see the controlled tension in his shoulders, and she understood immediately that Doyle was here because Vic had found out she was in Red Hawk, which meant someone had told him, which meant there was someone in Red Hawk watching her. "Please tell Mr. Vick," Callie said, "that his regards are not required." Doyle had looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, the particular look of a man cataloging a threat. And then he had turned back to Roan and finished whatever conversation they had been having about a routine complaint, which Callie had understood was not routine at all, but was Doyle's way of announcing that he knew the sheriff's activities and was not concerned about them. When Doyle left, she closed the door and told Roan what she had seen in the land office. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, his face was very calm in the way it got when he was thinking fast behind a controlled surface. "The land office is a problem," he said. "Garrett answers to Vick. If the document is there and we request to see it officially, it will be gone before the request is processed." "I know," she said. "We need federal authority to compel production," he said. "I have a contact in the circuit court, Judge Samuel Ford, out of Santa Fe. I've been corresponding with him for 2 months. He's clean. I trust him. If I can get a sworn deposition about the document's location to him, he can issue a compulsory order within 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Callie said. I know that's slower than you want it. 2 weeks gives Vic time to move everything. Yes, Roan said, which means we need to be very careful for the next 2 weeks not to let him know what we're actually after. She had nodded. She had understood. What she had not understood, what neither of them had anticipated, was that the information was already moving faster than they thought. The next morning, the front window of Mrs. Horn's boarding house had a note tucked under the door. It was written in block letters on ordinary paper, and it said, "Leave Red Hawk. You have 3 days." Mrs. Horn had brought it to Callie's room with her breakfast, a plate of eggs and toasted bread and the good coffee that Mrs. Horn kept for guests she liked, and had stood in the doorway with a look on her face that mixed concern with a 40-year resident's particular fury at being intimidated in her own home. "I don't appreciate people slipping threats under my door," Mrs. Horn said. She was a broad, steady woman in her 60s with white hair and the bearing of someone who had outlasted a great deal of difficulty. "And I don't intend to be run out of my own establishment, and I don't think you intend to be run out of town." "No," Callie said, looking at the note. "I don't." "Then eat your eggs," Mrs. Horn said, "and figure out your next move. And tell that sheriff of yours that someone is leaving threats on my doorstep, because I pay my taxes and I expect better." Callie took the note to Roan immediately. He read it twice, then looked up at her with an expression that had moved past careful into something more direct. "You need to know," he said, "that I am not going to let anything happen to you." It was a simple statement. It was not decorated with anything. He said it the way he said things that mattered, directly, without performance, and it hit her somewhere in the center of her chest and made her breath do something complicated. "I can take care of myself," she said. "I know that," he said. "I've watched you take care of yourself for 2 weeks. I'm saying that I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Those are different things." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked down at the note, because looking at his face right then was more information than she knew how to process before 9 in the morning. They agreed on a modified plan. She would continue her visible presence in town as if nothing had changed, shopping at the general store, taking meals at the boarding house, maintaining the illusion of a woman investigating property investments. Roan would send his letter to Judge Ford that day by the fastest available courier, a young man named Ellis who rode the mail route to Santa Fe and who Roan trusted absolutely. The evenings continued. The coffee continued. The work continued. And the other thing, the thing that was not the work but ran underneath it like a current under still water, continued too. building with the slow, inevitable pressure of things that have been carefully not said. On the 16th evening, he asked about Thomas. Not in a way that felt like interrogation or like guilt. He asked the way someone asks about a person who mattered, with the specific, careful interest of wanting to understand rather than simply to know. She told him. She told him about Thomas's laugh, and the way he had named all the horses on his ranch, something absurd and personal, and how he had been a man who believed, genuinely and without cynicism, that if you worked honestly and treated people decently, the world would return the favor. She told him that she had argued with him about that she had been more clear-eyed about it than he was, and that she had told him so, and that she had been right, and that being right had never once felt like anything other than a catastrophe. "I think about the things I didn't say to him," she said. "Not the last day. I didn't know it was the last day. I mean the ordinary days. I think about how many ordinary days I had with him and how I used them on ordinary things when I could have used them better." "People don't know to use the ordinary days better," Roan said. "They only know it afterward." "That's not very comforting." "No," he agreed. "It's just true." She was quiet for a moment. "What about you?" she asked, because the conversation had become personal enough that it seemed fair to make it mutual. He told her about a woman named Helen, years earlier in Abilene, who had decided that a lawman's life was not a life she could build herself into, and had left for Missouri before they had a chance to find out whether they were enough for each other. He told it plainly and without bitterness. He said it was probably the right decision for her and possibly for him too, given who he was at 27, though he had not thought so at the time. "You seem like someone who knows who he is," Callie said. "I know who I'm trying to be," he said. "That's different, but it's what I have." She looked at him across the table with its scattered papers, and the 2 tin cups of cooling coffee and the lamp burning low between them, and she felt the current under the water rise up and press against the surface of everything she had been managing, and she made a decision. "Roan," she said. He looked at her with the full, unhurried attention he always gave her. "I don't know what to do with you," she said honestly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have some thoughts about that if you'd like to hear them." "Later," she said, "after this is done. After Vic is finished and the case is made and everything that needs to be settled is settled. Then I'd like to hear your thoughts." He nodded. "Later," he agreed. And the word between them was not an ending but a promise held in reserve. The way you hold a candle against the dark and don't light it yet because you need to see where you're going first. 3 days after that, Warren Doyle walked into the Last Ember Saloon while Callie was there. She had not been there for entertainment. She had been there because one of Vic's ranch hands had let slip to Mrs. Horn's kitchen girl that Doyle was expecting a courier that evening. And couriers sometimes carried documents, and she had wanted to see who came in and what they were carrying. It was reconnaissance, not bravery, though she acknowledged privately that it was also not entirely wise. She had been sitting at a corner table with a glass of water she had not touched, watching the door, when Doyle walked in with 2 of his men. He had seen her immediately. The way his eyes found her across the room told her that he had known she would be there, that someone had told him, that she had been watched more carefully than she had understood. She had not been afraid. She had been angry, which was more useful. She had stayed in her chair and kept her face neutral, and had watched him walk toward her with the measured pace of a man making a point. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "sitting alone in a saloon at night is unusual for a respectable widow." "I find it clarifying," she said. "So do I," he said, and then the pleasantness had gone from his voice and his face in the way a landscape changes when the sun goes behind something permanent. "Let me be clear with you. Vic has been patient. Vic has been more than patient." but patience has a bottom and you have been in this town long enough. I'll leave when my business is concluded, she said. Your business, Doyle said, is going to be a problem for you if you don't walk away from it. I've had problems before, she said. That was when his man had moved behind her chair, and she had felt the gun at the back of her neck, and the saloon had gone quiet in the held-breath way of a room full of people who do not want to be involved in what they are witnessing. And then Roan Ellery had come through the door. He had heard about the courier, too. Ellis had run into a ranch hand outside the telegraph office, and Roan had put 2 and 2 together faster than she had given him credit for. He had come in, and he had read the room in about 3 seconds, and he had walked to the table with the particular calm of a man who is not going to be stopped. And Doyle's man had pressed the gun harder against the back of Callie's neck, and that was the moment she had looked at Roan with her question burning in her throat. What do you want from me? She had meant. Are you here for justice or for something I do not understand? She had meant, do I trust you? She had meant 3 years of fear and grief and uncertainty compressed into 4 words, and he had said, quiet as a prayer, just breakfast and 30 more years. And then he had moved, and Warren Doyle had gone down, and when the smoke cleared and the cuffs were on, and the deputies Roan had signaled on his way in had secured Doyle's other man, he had looked across the saloon at her with the gun still in his hand and his badge catching the lamplight. And his face was the face of a man who has just said the most honest thing he has ever said in a room full of witnesses, and is fully prepared to stand by it. The aftermath of Doyle's arrest moved quickly by Red Hawk standards. Roan held him on charges of threatening a citizen with deadly force, which was solid enough to keep him in the jail, and immediately sent a second, urgent message to Judge Ford requesting an accelerated response to the original letter. In the meantime, the arrest of Doyle, a known associate of Vic, put enough public pressure on Garrett at the land office that the nervous, thin, mustached man appeared at the sheriff's office the following morning before 9 o'clock, carrying a leather folder and the particular expression of a man who has decided that the safest side of a fight is the one that is about to win. Garrett laid the folder on Roan's desk. Inside it were 3 documents: the original deed to Thomas Crane's land, the forged version that Vic had filed, and a letter in Vic's own handwriting instructing Garrett to keep the originals in case they were needed to manage Doyle. He was going to use them against Doyle, Callie said when she had read the letter. Vic keeps everyone under his thumb with something, Roan said. He always has. What does this mean legally? She asked. Combined with the sworn depositions I've already sent Ford and the formal complaint we drafted, this is enough, Roan said. This is enough to compel federal action. Forgery of land documents is a federal offense. Vic can't buy his way out of a federal case the way he bought the county judge. Garrett, in exchange for his cooperation and his formal testimony, received protection and a reduced role in the charges, a deal that Callie was not entirely comfortable with, because Garrett had held those documents for 2 years and had said nothing, and 2 years of silence had cost people dearly. But she understood pragmatics. She understood that building a case sometimes required using the tools available rather than the tools you wished you had. She said as much to Roan that evening, in the office that had become their working space and their arguing space and their honest conversation space over the weeks. I know it isn't perfect justice, he said. It never is, she said. No, he agreed. But it's real, and it's moving, and Vic will answer for what he did. Not for everything, not for Thomas specifically, because criminal liability for a death that occurred in a holding cell from a fever is harder to prove than document fraud. But for the land theft and the forgery and the abuse of the court process, he'll answer. She sat with that for a long moment. The lamp burned steadily, Outside, the town was quiet with the particular quiet of late evening. "I thought I needed it to be total," she said. "To be everything, Thomas, Paul, all of it. I thought I needed every account settled to the last cent." "And now?" he asked. "Now I think I needed it to be real," she said. "I needed Vic to not simply continue existing as if none of it happened. I needed someone to say, officially, legally, with a record, that he was wrong and what he did was wrong and there are consequences. Whether that fills every hole it needs to fill, I don't know yet." "You might not know for a while," Roan said gently. "I know," she said. "I've gotten accustomed to not knowing things." He looked at her steadily. "I said later," he said, "on one of those things." The shift in the conversation was immediate and unmistakable, and she felt it in her shoulders and her breathing and the particular heightened attention of being looked at by someone who is actually seeing you. "Yes," she said. "The case is not finished," he said. "But it's in motion in a way I trust. Judge Ford will respond within the week. Doyle is in the jail. Garrett has given his testimony. I want to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty above everything else." "I do," she said. "I have been in this office with you nearly every evening for 3 weeks," he said. "And I have thought about you on the evenings we did not meet, and I have thought about you when I should have been thinking about other things, and I said what I said in the saloon because it was true, and because I have been wanting to say something true for a while." Callie was quiet for a moment. The careful structure of distance she had been maintaining had been loosening for some time now, and she could feel the last of it giving way, and she found that she was not afraid of what was underneath it. Not afraid of the feeling itself, but uncertain about whether she was allowed to have it, whether it was right, whether it was a kind of betrayal of Thomas, or whether Thomas, who had been a generous man with a good heart, would have looked at this situation and said something sensible about it. "I loved my husband," she said. "I need you to understand that." "I know," Roan said. "I know you did. And I know that what I'm saying doesn't ask you to stop. I'm not asking you to choose or to replace anything. I'm asking you to consider the possibility of something new alongside the things you've already had." "Breakfast," she said. "And 30 more years," he said. And there was something in his voice when he said it, warmth and steadiness and the absolute absence of uncertainty, that made her understand that he had meant it exactly as simply and exactly as seriously as it had sounded. She reached across the table and placed her hand on his, and his hand turned under hers and held it, and they sat like that for a while in the quiet of the lamplight. It was not a kiss or a dramatic declaration. It was something quieter and more durable, the beginning of a decision, made honestly and in full knowledge of everything that had preceded it. Judge Samuel Ford's response arrived 11 days later, delivered by federal courier directly to the sheriff's office. It was a compulsory order requiring Garrett's testimony to be taken formally in a federal deposition, and it named Aldous Vick in a formal complaint of document fraud and abuse of territorial court process. It also, attached as a separate document, included a judicial finding, based on the evidence submitted, that the original land deed registered to Thomas Crane was valid, and that the registration executed by Vick's filing was fraudulent and legally void. Callie read the finding 3 times. She held the paper in her hands and read it 3 times, and the 3rd time she read it, she set it down on Roan's desk and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed in and breathed out and did not cry, because she had made a decision some time ago about crying in front of men, but it was close. Roan did not say anything. He simply placed his hand over hers on the desk and left it there. "The land," she said after a moment. "The original land. Legally restored," he said. "You'd have to file to reclaim the title, but the legal basis is there now. Ford's finding makes it clear." "I don't want to go back to Abilene," she said, and the truth of it surprised her even as she said it. "I thought I did. I thought everything I wanted was undoing what was done, but I don't think I want to go back to that place and that life. I think I want what comes after." Roan looked at her carefully. "What does after look like?" She met his eyes. "I'm working on that." Aldous Vick left Red Hawk 2 days after the federal order arrived. He did not do it dramatically or with any announcement. He simply was not there one morning, and his cattle operation was being managed by a nervous foreman who had no interest in being associated with a man under federal investigation. Vick had gone east, according to the foreman, and would be handling the charges through his attorney. The attorney, as it turned out, could not make the federal charges disappear. The forgery was documented too clearly, and Garrett's testimony was too specific, and Judge Ford was a man whose reputation for incorruptibility was the foundation of his career. Vick was indicted in the fall of 1882 and convicted the following spring of document fraud, filing false land claims, and abuse of the judicial process. He was sentenced to 7 years in the federal penitentiary, and the conviction was a matter of public record. Callie read the news of the conviction on a Thursday morning at Mrs. Horn's kitchen table, where she had been eating breakfast for 3 months. She read the newspaper account twice, slowly and carefully, and then she folded the paper and set it beside her plate and ate the rest of her toast. "Is that it?" Mrs. Horn asked, refilling her coffee. She had known the general outline of things for a while. Mrs. Horn was the kind of woman who knew the general outline of everything in her immediate vicinity, and had watched the proceedings with the steady interest of a woman who believes in justice even when it is slow. "That's it," Callie said. "Good," Mrs. Horn said. "Pass the jam." In the weeks following the Doyle arrest and the arrival of Ford's order, Red Hawk had done what small towns always do when a large tension resolves. It breathed out and went back to being a town. The saloon played piano. The blacksmith hammered. Children walked to the schoolhouse in the mornings and ran back out again in the afternoons. The ordinary rhythm of a working settlement in New Mexico Territory in 1882 resumed its pace. Callie's role in it changed. She stopped being a woman on a mission passing through and became, gradually and almost without deciding to, a woman living somewhere. She helped Mrs. Horn with the boarding house accounts because Mrs. Horn's eyesight was not what it had been and the bookkeeping had been getting approximate. She started teaching reading and arithmetic on 2 afternoons a week at the schoolhouse, because the schoolteacher, a young man named Mr. Webb, had confessed to her that he was not confident in his arithmetic beyond the basics, and she had taught it to children in Abilene years ago, and it came back immediately. She had coffee with Roan in the mornings now, not just the evenings. This had started almost accidentally. She had been walking past his office one morning when he had come out with 2 cups and offered her one, and it had become a habit with the quiet inevitability of things that are meant to continue. They stood on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office in the morning light with their coffee and talked about ordinary things. What was happening in town, what she had covered in the schoolhouse the previous afternoon, what he was dealing with in terms of the routine business of keeping a working town functional and honest. The romantic arc of it moved the way real things move, which is to say not dramatically but in the accumulated weight of small moments. He walked her home from the school on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. She left food for him on the evenings when she knew he was working late, a plate covered with a cloth that she left on his desk when he was out on a call. He asked her one Sunday if she would like to ride out to the eastern edge of the valley with him, where the mesa turned red in the afternoon light, and she said yes. And they rode out and stood at the edge of it and looked out over a landscape of such enormous, austere beauty that there was nothing adequate to say about it. And so they said nothing and just stood there together in the silence. He kissed her for the first time on the evening after they received the news of Vic's indictment. Not dramatically or suddenly, but in the way of something that has been becoming inevitable and has simply arrived at its moment. They were standing in the doorway of his office, which was where their evenings always ended, and she had said good night, and he had said good night, and then neither of them had moved, and he had taken her hand the way he always did now. And then he had leaned forward slightly and kissed her, once, gently, and then looked at her with the direct honesty that was the most characteristic thing about him. She had kissed him back, which was her answer to everything he had ever asked her or wanted to say. About those 30 years, she said, when they had separated enough to speak. What about them? He said. His voice was quieter than usual. I'm counting them from now, she said. Not from the saloon. Now. That's fair, he said. Mrs. Horn, when Callie came back to the boarding house, looked at her face and smiled the smile of a woman who has seen everything and is pleased about this particular thing. Good, she said simply, and went back to her knitting. The autumn in Red Hawk was something Callie had not expected to be beautiful. She had thought of the Southwest as unforgiving, and it was. The land was hard and the sun was merciless, and the wind in October came down from the north with a cold edge that surprised you. But the sky went a color in the evenings that she had never seen anywhere else, a deep, burning amber orange that spread from one horizon to the other and made the red rock turn almost violet in the shadows. And she had started carrying a small journal to write down the specific quality of light on specific evenings, not for any purpose, but because she wanted to have it. She had found, in Roan Ellery, a man who did not shrink from complexity or uncomfortable truths, who applied the same relentless honesty to his thinking that he applied to his work, and who was, when you knew him past the professional surface, unexpectedly tender in the way of people who are fundamentally decent and who have not been given quite enough credit for it. He had found, in Callie Crane, a woman who matched him completely in intelligence and significantly exceeded him in organizational precision, who had a capacity for warmth that was all the more striking for being carefully guarded, and who laughed at exactly the right things with exactly the kind of laugh that makes you want to spend your life finding more of those things. He proposed to her in March of 1883, 3 weeks after Vic's conviction was confirmed. He did not do it in public, which she appreciated. He did it on a Sunday morning at the Mesa, where they had been riding regularly since the first time, and where the light in March was different from the autumn light, cleaner, thinner, with a sharpness to it that made everything very clear. He got down from his horse and she got down from hers, and they walked to the edge of the mesa and stood looking out at the valley, and he said, "I'd like us to get married." She turned to look at him. He met her eyes directly. "I know this town isn't Abilene. I know this isn't the life you thought you were building, but I think it could be a good life. I think it could be a very good life if you want it. I think we could make something here that lasts." She looked at his face, at the honest, weathered lines of it, at the steady copper-gold eyes, at the man who had stood between her and a gun barrel and said the most unexpected thing anyone had ever said to her. And she thought about Thomas, whom she would always love and always grieve, and she thought about Paul, and she thought about the years of running and the long wait of surviving, and she thought about what came after. "Yes," she said, "I want it." He exhaled, and it was the only time she had ever seen him do something that looked like relief, and she realized that despite everything he had said and done with such steady certainty, some part of him had not been entirely sure she would say it, and that vulnerability in him was one of the things she loved most. She stepped forward and he caught her, and they stood at the edge of the mesa with the march light spreading out across the valley and the horses grazing quietly behind them, and she thought, "This is what after looks like." They were married in May of 1883 in the Red Hawk Church, which was also the schoolhouse, and which had been decorated for the occasion by Mrs. Horn and a committee of ladies from the town who had decided this warranted decoration. The ceremony was conducted by the circuit preacher, who came through every 6 weeks, and who had the practical efficiency of a man who performs weddings across 300 miles of territory and has learned to make them both brief and meaningful. Callie wore the blue dress she had bought in Santa Fe the previous October, which was not specifically a wedding dress, but was a very good dress in the particular blue of early morning sky, and she wore her dark hair pinned up with the tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's. Roan wore his good coat and his good hat and his badge, because he was the sheriff of Red Hawk, and that was not a thing he set aside, and she had told him she would not want him to. Mrs. Horn cried. Ellis, the mail courier, who had been invited because he had written the letter to Ford that changed everything, sat in the front row and blew his nose twice. Roan took Callie's hand during the ceremony and held it, and she held back, and when the preacher said the words she said them too, simply and clearly, looking at Roan's face. They had a wedding supper at Mrs. Horn's boarding house, the full dining room with the good china out and a cake that Mrs. Horn had made with dried apricots, because there were no fresh peaches to be had in May in Red Hawk, and which was, everyone agreed, the best cake they had ever eaten. Roan and Callie moved into the house on the east side of Red Hawk's Main Street that had been empty since the previous winter. It was not large, 2 rooms downstairs and 2 above, but it had good windows and a solid roof, and a kitchen that Callie stood in on the first morning and assessed with the eye of someone who intends to put it to use. She made breakfast that first morning with the confidence of a woman who has been cooking for herself in difficult conditions for 3 years, and has therefore nothing to prove but every reason to enjoy the improvement. She made eggs and bacon and cornbread with the tin of molasses she had bought at the general store the previous afternoon, and she set it on the table, and Roan came downstairs and looked at it, and then at her with an expression she was beginning to catalogue as his particular morning face, unhurried and warm and present in a way she had not encountered in many people. "Breakfast," she said. He sat down and looked at her across the table and said, "1 down." She looked at him with a raised eyebrow. 29 years, 11 months, and 364 days to go, he said. She sat across from him and poured the coffee, and felt something she had not felt in so long that she almost did not recognize it, the uncomplicated, weightless sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. "You're going to count every morning?" she asked. "Every one," he said. She took a sip of her coffee and said, "Then I had better make sure the coffee is consistently good." He smiled, a real smile, the kind that went all the way to the copper-gold eyes, and said, "It already is." The life they built was real and specific and occasionally difficult in the way all real lives are, and mostly wonderful in the way that real lives, at their best, manage to be. Roan continued as sheriff of Red Hawk, and proved over the years to be the kind of lawman that a small territory town needed in its particular season of growth. Firm without cruelty, thorough without ruthlessness, the kind of steady presence that made people feel that the law meant something and was worth respecting. He dealt with cattle disputes and occasional violence, and the constant low-level friction of a place where land and money and ambition pressed against each other every day. And he dealt with all of it with the same methodical, honest attention he brought to everything. Callie kept the schoolhouse work and expanded it. By the following year, she had taken on the full teaching role because Mr. Webb had been offered a better position in Santa Fe and had gone, and the town needed a teacher, and she was unambiguously the most qualified person available. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic to the children of Red Hawk, and found, to her considerable surprise, that it was the most satisfying work she had done in her life outside of the case against Vic. That there was something in the daily effort of helping people gain access to the tools of understanding that answered something in her that she had not known was looking for an answer. She filed the paperwork on Thomas's original land in Abilene that summer. She did it carefully and with full documentation, using the federal finding as her legal foundation, and the title was formally restored. She sold the land. She had meant what she said about not going back to Abilene, and used the proceeds to fund a new schoolhouse building in Red Hawk with proper desks and a stove that actually worked and enough space for the growing number of children in the town. Mrs. Horn said this was the best possible use for the money. Roan said nothing at all, but the look on his face when the new building was finished and she showed him around it was one she kept alongside the Mesa light, and the wedding morning in the collection of things she intended to remember precisely. Their first child was born in the spring of 1884, a boy they named Samuel Thomas Ellery, Samuel for Judge Ford, without whose integrity none of the preceding events would have resolved the way they did, and Thomas for the man whose loss had set everything in motion and whose memory deserved to be carried forward into something good. Sam was, from his first weeks, the kind of baby who has opinions. "You're very good at this," she told him one morning, when Sam was 3 months old and she had come downstairs to find them in the kitchen, Roan with his coffee in one hand and Sam propped against his shoulder with the other, both of them apparently absorbed in looking out the window at the morning light on the main street. "I'm making it up," Roan said without turning around. "So is everyone," she said, and went to make the eggs. Doyle, meanwhile, had remained in the Red Hawk jail through the spring and had then been transferred to the territorial facility to serve his sentence for the charges against him. He was not a factor in their lives after that, except as a resolved chapter. Garrett had closed his land office in Red Hawk and moved to Albuquerque, which seemed to Callie a reasonable outcome for a man who had held critical evidence for 2 years, while staying carefully uninvolved, free, but not quite comfortable anywhere near the scene of his choices. Warren Doyle was released in 1886 after serving his time, and he left the territory entirely. Nobody in Red Hawk had any further trouble from him. The town grew. Red Hawk in 1884 was not what it had been in 1882. The railroad, which had been slowly creeping across the territory, had been routed close enough that a spur line was proposed, and the proposal brought investors and speculators and new settlers, which brought new disputes and new demands on the sheriff's office and new children in the schoolhouse. Callie had 2 assistants by 1885. Young women she had trained herself, both of whom could teach the basics while she handled the older students who were working toward more advanced material. Ellis, the mail courier, married a woman named Dorothy who had come to Red Hawk with her family as new settlers, and Callie attended the wedding with Sam on her hip and Roan at her side and felt the particular pleasure of watching the ordinary machinery of community work the way it was supposed to. Their second child arrived in 1886, a girl they named Ruth Eleanor Ellery. Ruth because it was a name both of them simply liked without needing to explain it, and Eleanor for Roan's mother, whose photograph sat on the mantelpiece and who had died 2 years before Roan met Callie, but of whom he spoke with such quiet affection that Callie felt she knew her. Ruth was different from Sam in the way that siblings are always different, confounding the expectations you build from the first one, quieter, more observant, the kind of small person who watches a room before entering it and has usually understood everything in it by the time everyone else has finished introductions. She had Callie's dark eyes and Roan's deliberate way of thinking, and by the time she was 2 years old, she was sitting in the corner of the kitchen while Sam charged around the house making various forms of noise, and Ruth watched him with a thoughtful expression that suggested she was composing her assessment of the situation. Sam adored his sister from the beginning. He was protective in a way that was completely unnecessary given that Ruth was entirely capable of taking care of herself, but which Callie recognized as having nothing to do with necessity, and everything to do with the particular bond that exists between children who grow up close together in a household full of love. The years settled into shape. Not without difficulty. There were hard winters and dry summers and disputes that tested the limits of what law could do and what community goodwill could sustain. There was a season in 1887 when a drought hit the eastern ranches hard, and the town was under a pressure that affected everyone. And Roan spent months mediating between cattle operations that were competing for water access. And Callie organized the practical community response, sharing resources, adjusting the school schedule to account for families that needed their older children working, coordinating with Mrs. Horn on the boarding house capacity that had been stretched by people coming in from the surrounding land. They argued, sometimes, because they were both people with strong views and the intelligence to defend them, and because a real marriage between two people like that is going to have friction, and that is not a failure but a feature, as long as the friction is honest. They argued about the school's budget, and about a fence dispute that Roan handled in a way Callie thought was too lenient, and about whether Sam needed more discipline or simply more patience. And they argued about these things openly and directly, and then worked them out with the same honesty that had been the foundation of everything since that first conversation in the sheriff's office. And they made up, which was its own kind of conversation, and which they were both quite good at. On the morning of their 5th wedding anniversary, in May of 1888, Roan made breakfast. This was not unusual. They had long since organized their mornings on a rotating informal system. But this morning, he had made it the way she had made it on their first morning in their house. Eggs and bacon and cornbread with molasses, the exact same meal. She came downstairs and found it waiting and looked at him across the table. 5 years, she said. 5 down, he said. 25 to go. She sat down and looked at the food and looked at him, and thought about the woman she had been in 1882. Riding into Red Hawk with a stolen horse and a forged document, and 3 years of grief driving her like a hard wind. She thought about the long road from that morning to this one, and all the moments along it, the confession in the lamplight, the kiss in the doorway, the mesa in March, the schoolhouse full of children, Sam on Roan's shoulder in the kitchen, Ruth watching the world with her dark, careful eyes. "I want to say something," she said. "All right," he said. "When I came here," she said, "I was coming for the end of a story. I thought that was all there was, get the document, expose Vic, settle the account. I thought that was what surviving looked like. I didn't understand that surviving wasn't the goal." He was listening with the full attention he always gave her. "Living is the goal," she said. "I understand that now. I think I have understood it for a while, but I wanted to say it to you specifically, because you are where I understand it most clearly." He reached across the table and took her hand, and held it the way he had in the office that first night when she had told him about Thomas, with the particular gentleness of someone who understands the weight of the thing being held. "You are where I understand everything most clearly," he said. They sat there in the morning light with their coffee, and their 5-year breakfast, and the sound of Sam beginning to wake up upstairs and Ruth's quieter voice, talking to her rag doll in the manner of someone conducting a very important conference. The world outside the window was Red Hawk going about its morning, the blacksmith already at work, the sound of the baker loading his delivery cart, a dog barking once and then stopping, the clean high-altitude light of a New Mexico spring coming in through the kitchen curtains that she had sewn herself, and that Roan had told her were very nice, which was his way of saying he had noticed that she had made the house into a home. The third child arrived in 1889, a boy they named Daniel Roan Ellery, which gave Sam a younger brother and Ruth a younger companion in watching Sam with patient skepticism. Daniel was the most even-tempered of the three, a quality that seemed almost like a gift to parents who had already raised two very distinct personalities, and who arrived at each new stage of his development with a kind of placid curiosity that made Callie think more than once that some children are simply born with a constitution that matches the life they land in. The schoolhouse in 1890 had 43 students and 2 full-time teachers under Callie's administration, and she had written a curriculum guide that was distributed to 3 other territory schoolhouses at the request of a territorial education committee, which was the first time she had been asked to influence educational policy, and which she found more interesting than she had expected. Roan, in 1891, was offered the position of territorial marshal, a regional role covering a much wider jurisdiction, with a headquarters in Santa Fe and a significant increase in pay and authority. He brought the offer home and laid it on the kitchen table and sat across from Callie and told her about it completely, because that was how they operated. She read the letter carefully. She asked about the terms, the travel requirements, the practical implications for the household. "What do you want to do?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "I want to know what you think." "I think it's the right recognition of the kind of lawman you are," she said. "I think you would be very good at it. I think the territory needs people who do this work the way you do it." "That's not quite what I asked," he said. She looked at him. "I think we can handle the travel," she said. "I think the children are old enough now. I think Mrs. Horn would be happy to have us closer to Santa Fe because she has been complaining about Red Hawk winters for the last 3 years, and this would give her a reason to consider moving herself." "You'd leave Red Hawk," he said. "Red Hawk will still be Red Hawk," she said. "Wherever we live, I can teach." "That matters to me, but it isn't location-specific. What I have that is location-specific is here." She touched the table. Table, this kitchen, these children in this house, you." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere important without you," she said. "If that wasn't already understood, let me make it clear." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I told them I would need to discuss it with my wife first," he said. "Then go back to them and tell them yes," she said. "But tell them we need 6 months to make the move properly, because I am not uprooting 3 children and a household in a hurry." He went back and told them yes. They spent the 6 months arranging the move with the organized thoroughness that characterized how Callie approached everything, methodically, completely, without leaving anything important behind. Mrs. Horn came to Santa Fe. She arrived 3 months after Roan and Callie, having decided, with the energy of a woman who is not done living, regardless of what her knees think about it, that she would open a proper boarding house in a proper city and see what Santa Fe could do with her. What Santa Fe could do with her, it turned out, was considerable. Mrs. Horn's establishment became one of the better-regarded boarding houses in the city within a year, and she presided over it with the same steady authority she had brought to Red Hawk and the same comprehensive knowledge of everyone in her immediate vicinity. Sam, at 7, entered the Santa Fe school system and announced at the end of his first week that his mother could clearly do better, which Callie found both flattering and typical. Ruth, at 5, entered school and said nothing about the quality of the instruction for 3 months, after which she produced a very detailed written assessment that Callie read with a complicated mixture of parental pride and professional concern. Daniel, at 2, was mostly interested in the wagon that the baker used to deliver goods on the street outside their new house, and his personal assessment of Santa Fe was positive. Roan took to the marshalling work with the same focused integrity he had brought to everything, and the broader jurisdiction meant that he was doing more of what he was best at. The careful, document-based, procedurally thorough kind of law enforcement that built cases that actually held in federal court rather than collapsed at the first hostile pressure. He traveled the territory on a regular circuit and came home with the accumulated weight of what he had seen, which he and Callie talked through in the evenings at the kitchen table, because that was where they had always done their best thinking, and she understood his work the way that only someone who has worked closely with him can, and he understood hers, and they were genuinely useful to each other in the way that the best partnerships are. In 1892, 9 years after their wedding, Callie was appointed to the Territorial Education Board, the first woman to hold such a position in New Mexico Territory, a fact that was noted by the Santa Fe newspapers, and which she received with the characteristic expression of a woman who considers the recognition correct and is slightly impatient with the degree to which it is being treated as surprising. She wrote a letter to Judge Samuel Ford, who was still on the bench, to tell him about the appointment. Ford wrote back with the warmth of a man who takes genuine pleasure in the good outcomes of difficult cases, and who had received every update about the Crane-Ellery developments over the years with what his correspondence suggested was great satisfaction. Sam was growing into a version of himself that had Callie's precision and Roan's steadiness and his own particular quality. A social ease, a fundamental enjoyment of people that neither of his parents possessed in quite the same degree. He was the child who knew everyone in the neighborhood by name and was known by everyone in return. And at 9, he was clearly going to be someone people liked and relied on, which was a quality that his parents appreciated without entirely understanding where it had come from. Ruth was a reader and a thinker, and had already read everything in the house, and was working through the Santa Fe Public Library with systematic attention. At 7, she had opinions about territorial land policy that were better researched than most adults Callie had met, which was both impressive and occasionally exhausting. Daniel had discovered horses. He was, at 4, already the child who could be found near the stable at every available opportunity, talking to the horses in the same placid, reasonable way that he talked to everything, with the calm assurance of someone who has decided that the world responds well to good manners and honest interest. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, in May of 1893, Roan and Callie sat on the porch of their house in the Santa Fe evening, which was different from the Red Hawk evening, cooler and with more sounds of city life, but which had the same vast sky turning amber in the west. With their coffee, the children fed and settled, the house quiet around them. 10 years, she said. 10 down, he said. 20 to go. She looked at him. He had more lines around his eyes now, and the gray at his temples had been progressing steadily, and he was wearing the face of a man who had lived a decade of full, demanding, meaningful life, and it was the most beautiful face she had ever seen. "You are still counting," she said. "I am always counting," he said. She leaned against his shoulder, which she had been doing for 10 years in the various configurations of their various homes, and which never felt like anything other than the most natural thing she could do with her body. "I was thinking about the saloon," she said. "I think about it sometimes," he said. "You asked me the question I had been trying to find the right way to answer for 3 weeks. And you answered it in the most ridiculous way possible," she said. "It worked," he said. "It worked," she agreed. She thought about the gun at the back of her neck, and the fury and fear running through her, and the moment when this large, careful, honest man had looked at her with everything open in his face and said the simplest thing, and how it had been exactly the right thing, which was typical of him. He had a gift for saying the simple, true thing at the moment when everyone else was trying to be complicated. "You know what I thought when you said it?" she asked. "No," he said. He was listening with the full attention she would never stop being grateful for. "I thought you were out of your mind," she said. "And then I thought about what it would actually mean. Breakfast in 30 years. And I thought, that is either the most ridiculous thing anyone has said in a saloon or the most important, and I could not figure out which. What did you decide?" "Both," she said. "It was both." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair, and she felt him smile. "Both seems right," he said. They sat on the porch until the amber had faded to dark blue, and the stars were fully out over Santa Fe. Vast and brilliant the way they are at altitude, the way they were over the mesa the day he had asked her, and over the church the day she had said yes, and over every morning since. The sky that had been above all of it, indifferent in its size and somehow generous in its steadiness. The children grew. The years continued. Roan served as territorial marshal through the rest of the decade, and into the early years of the next century with the same relentless, principled attention to the job. And the territory was measurably better for it. Not perfectly better, not solved, because no single person solves a place, but better in the specific ways that careful, honest work makes things better, incrementally and permanently. Callie's work on the education board shaped the territory's school curriculum for a generation, and the schools she influenced produced people who could read and think and reason, which was what she had always believed education was for. Sam became a lawyer, which surprised no one. He set up practice in Albuquerque and specialized in land rights, which had a particular meaning given the family's history. And he was very good at it, because he had inherited both his mother's precision with documents and his father's ability to make people trust that he was going to be straight with them. Ruth went east for university, which was still an unusual thing for a woman in 1900, but which was so clearly the right thing for Ruth that no one in the family seriously questioned it. She came back with a degree in history and a commitment to writing a comprehensive account of territorial land disputes in the Southwest, beginning with the case that had brought her parents to Red Hawk in 1882. She interviewed her mother at length, and her father, an old Judge Ford, who was retired by then but still sharp, and she produced a document of such thorough scholarship that it was eventually cited in 3 separate federal land cases. Daniel married a woman named Clara who loved horses as much as he did, and ran a horse breeding operation outside of Santa Fe with a quality and reputation that attracted buyers from across the territory and beyond. Their children, 2 boys, noisy and cheerful and wild about horses, were, in the combined assessment of their grandparents, the most entertaining people of their acquaintance. Mrs. Horn lived to 91, which seemed about right. Her boarding house in Santa Fe was taken over by a younger woman who had been her apprentice for 15 years, and who ran it with the same standards and the same comprehensive knowledge of the neighborhood. Mrs. Horn's last years were comfortable and social and full of opinion, and she died in her own bed, with the satisfaction of a woman who had done exactly what she set out to do. The 30th anniversary was in May of 1913. Callie was 55 and Roan was 57, and they were in Red Hawk for the weekend because Sam had business in the area and had suggested they all make the trip, and because they both wanted to see the town again, the place where everything had started. Red Hawk was different, as everywhere is different after 30 years. The railroad spur had come and brought growth, and the main street had more buildings and more people, and the Last Ember Saloon was now a hardware store, and the sheriff's office had been expanded twice. The schoolhouse Callie had funded with Thomas's land money was still standing, still being used, though it was now the older of 2 school buildings in the town. They rode out to the mesa on the Sunday morning, just the 2 of them, the way they always had. The mesa had not changed in the way towns change. The land was the land. The red rock was the red rock. The valley spread below in its enormous, austere beauty as it always had. They stood at the edge and looked out, and Callie thought about the March morning when he had asked her, and she had said yes, and the October morning when they had first stood here and said nothing because there was nothing adequate, and all the mornings since, stacked up behind them like light. 30 years, she said. He took her hand. His hand was still large and warm and scarred in the way of a working life, and holding it was still the most natural thing she could do. All of them, he said, exactly what I wanted. She turned to look at him, this man who had stood between her and a gun barrel and answered her question with the most honest and improbable answer in the world. This man who had counted mornings and held her hand and listened to her and built a life alongside her with the same steady, relentless integrity he brought to everything. "What do you want from me?" she had asked 30 years ago in a saloon full of smoke and danger, not meaning it as an invitation, not meaning it as a question with the answer it received, just breakfast, he had said. And 30 more years, she had given him both. He had given them back. That was how it had worked, not simply, not without grief or difficulty or the weight of what had been lost before either of them arrived at the place where they found each other, but honestly and completely, and with the whole weight of 2 serious people who had decided that the thing between them was worth the full commitment of everything they had. "Come on," she said and squeezed his hand. "I'll make breakfast when we get back." He smiled. The copper-gold eyes were warm in the morning light, as warm as they had been in the lamplight of the sheriff's office in 1882, when he had said things he meant, and she had been beginning to know that she would believe him. 29 years, 11 months, 364 days more to go, he said. She laughed. The laugh that had been the one he was still finding reasons for, 30 years later, because it was still the best sound he had ever heard. They rode back down from the mesa together, into the red morning and the real world and the continued life waiting for them, which was not a perfect life, but was theirs completely, built from honesty and grief and persistence, and the particular grace of 2 people who had found each other in the middle of the hardest thing and decided to keep going together, all the way.